The gunshot cracked through the estate before Grace Bennett even reached the front gate. She froze on the gravel path, her suitcase handle biting into her palm, her heart slamming against her ribs. Two guards near the iron fence barely looked up from their card game. One of them, a broad man with a scar above his eyebrow, waved her forward without concern, as if gunfire near a private mansion was as normal as birdsong. "That's just Victor testing the range targets," he said. "Boss doesn't like idle men. Keep moving, you're expected." Grace swallowed hard and kept walking. She had taken plenty of nanny positions before, but none of them came with armed men at the gate or the smell of gun oil in the morning air. She almost turned around right there. But then she thought of the child waiting inside, a 6-year-old girl who, according to the agency, had not spoken more than a few words to any adult in over a year. That thought kept her feet moving. The mansion rose in front of her like something built to intimidate rather than welcome. Tall black gates, manicured hedges cut into sharp angles, security cameras mounted on every corner. A housekeeper met her at the door, a thin older woman named Marta, who looked at Grace with something close to pity. "You're the fourth one this year," Marta said, taking her coat. The others didn't last a week. Why not? Marta glanced toward a closed set of double doors down the hall, lowering her voice. "Because of him, Mr. Marino doesn't smile. He doesn't laugh. He barely speaks, unless it's an order." The last nanny said this house felt like a funeral that never ended. Grace absorbed this quietly. She had read the file the agency gave her. Daniel Marino, widower, 1 daughter, employer of considerable wealth, and, the file vaguely noted, connections in private security and import business. Grace was not foolish. She understood what kind of world she was stepping into. But the moment she had seen the photograph of little Lily Marino, sitting alone in a garden with her eyes fixed on nothing, something in Grace's chest had tightened. She recognized that look. She had worn it herself once, a long time ago. Marta led her down a long hallway lined with cold marble floors and closed doors, until they reached the study. She knocked once, then opened the door and stepped back, refusing to enter herself. "Mr. Marino, the new nanny is here." Grace stepped inside. The study was dark, heavy curtains blocking most of the daylight, the walls lined with old books that looked like they had never been touched. Behind a wide desk sat a man who did not look up immediately. He was writing something, his jaw tight, his shoulders set like stone. When he finally raised his eyes to her, Grace felt the full weight of his stare settle on her skin. Daniel Marino was younger than she expected, maybe in his late 30s, with dark hair combed back and sharp features that might have been handsome if there had been any warmth behind them. His eyes were the coldest part of him, gray and distant, like a winter sky that had forgotten what sunlight felt like. "Sit," he said. It was not a request. Grace sat. "You've read the file," he said. "You know what happened to my wife." Grace nodded carefully. The file had said very little, only that his wife had died 12 years ago, in what was described as an accident, no further details. "Then you know why my daughter doesn't speak much," he continued, "and you know I don't have patience for nannies who try to fix her like she's broken. She isn't broken, she's careful. There's a difference." "I understand," Grace said, and she meant it. Daniel studied her for a long moment, as if trying to find a crack in her composure. Grace held his gaze without flinching, though her pulse was racing beneath her calm expression. Something about him made the air in the room feel thinner. "The last 3 nannies quit because they were afraid of this house," he said. "Are you afraid?" "A little," Grace admitted, "but not enough to leave." For the briefest second, something flickered behind his eyes. It was gone before she could name it. He rose from his chair and walked to the window, pulling back the heavy curtain just enough to let a thin line of daylight fall across the desk. For a moment, he simply stood there, his back to her, his broad shoulders outlined against the gray afternoon light. 12 years ago, this house was full of noise, he said, his voice quieter now, almost distant. "My wife used to leave the windows open even in winter because she liked the sound of birds in the morning. After she died, I closed every curtain in this house and never opened them again. I stopped noticing whether it was day or night most weeks." Grace remained silent, sensing that interrupting would close whatever door had briefly opened. I'm telling you this, he continued, turning back to face her, so you understand what you're walking into. This isn't a house that heals easily. I've tried, in my own way, to give my daughter everything she needs, but I don't know how to give her warmth. I don't have it left to give. Everyone has it left to give, Grace said quietly. Sometimes, it just needs a reason to come back out. Daniel studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his tired eyes, before he returned to his seat, the brief window of vulnerability closing as quickly as it had opened. There are rules, he said. You do not ask questions about my work. You do not ask questions about my wife. You do not bring outsiders into this house without my permission. You keep Lily safe, and you keep her calm. That is all I require. And if she needs more than calm, Grace asked, before she could stop herself. Children need to feel things, Mr. Marino, not just be managed. His jaw tightened. You've been here 5 minutes, and you're already questioning how I raise my daughter. I'm not questioning you, Grace said gently. I'm telling you what I know. Fear doesn't heal a child. Patience does. He stared at her, clearly unused to being spoken to this way inside his own house. For a moment, Grace thought she had ruined her chance before it even began. Then, unexpectedly, he leaned back in his chair. You start today, he said. If you last a month, we'll discuss your future here. If you don't bother saying goodbye. Nobody else has. It was not a warm welcome, but it was a beginning. Marta showed Grace to the East Wing, where Lily's room sat at the end of a quiet corridor, decorated with photographs, that all seemed to stop at a certain point in time, as if the family's happiness had been frozen 12 years ago, and never continued. Grace paused in front of one photograph of a smiling woman holding a baby. She did not need to ask who it was. Lily's door was slightly open. Grace knocked softly and stepped inside. The room was neat, almost too neat for a child's space. Toys sat untouched on shelves, arranged by size rather than played with. Lily sat by the window in a small chair, staring out at the garden, her small hands folded in her lap. She did not turn around when Grace entered. Hello, Lily, Grace said softly, kneeling down a respectful distance away. My name is Grace. I'm going to be spending time with you now. Lily said nothing. She did not even blink. Grace did not push. She simply sat down on the floor near the window, several feet away, and looked out at the same garden Lily was watching. Minutes passed in silence. Grace did not fill the quiet with forced cheerfulness, the way the other nannies probably had. She simply existed beside the girl, patient and still. After nearly 10 minutes, Lily spoke, so quietly Grace almost missed it. You didn't ask me to talk. Grace turned her head slowly. I figured you'd talk when you wanted to, not before. Lily studied her for the first time, her small face unreadable, so much like her father's. The others always wanted me to talk right away. They got tired of waiting. I'm not in a hurry, Grace said. Something shifted in the girl's expression, not quite a smile, but a loosening, like a knot beginning to soften. It was small, but Grace felt it like a victory. The rest of the afternoon passed with small, careful steps. Grace did not try to force conversation. She simply sat with Lily while she looked at picture books, offering comments only when invited, letting silence exist without trying to fix it. By the time the sun began to set, Lily had shown her a drawing she had made of a garden with 2 suns instead of 1. Why 2 suns? Grace asked. Lily shrugged. Because 1 alone looks lonely. Grace felt something tighten in her chest at that, but she kept her voice steady. That's a beautiful reason. They spent the rest of the afternoon adding more details to the drawing. Small birds perched in the branches of a tall tree, a winding path leading toward a tiny house in the corner of the page. Grace asked gentle questions along the way, careful never to push too hard, letting Lily reveal herself at her own pace. She learned that the girl loved the color yellow, that she was frightened of thunderstorms, and that she kept a small stuffed rabbit hidden beneath her pillow because she believed it helped her mother watch over her from wherever she had gone. Do you think that's silly? Lily asked quietly, glancing up at Grace with uncertain eyes, as though bracing herself for laughter or dismissal. I think it's one of the least silly things I've ever heard, Grace said honestly. Sometimes the things we hold on to are exactly what we need to feel safe. There's nothing silly about that at all. Lily's shoulders relaxed, some invisible tension easing out of her small frame, and for the rest of the afternoon she chattered more freely than she had in months, according to what Marta later confided to Grace in a hushed, astonished voice. By the time evening approached, the girl had shown Grace 3 more drawings, each one a little braver than the last, each one carrying a little more color and light than the isolated sketches that had filled her room before Grace's arrival. Dinner that evening was a formal affair, the 3 of them seated at a long table that seemed built for a much larger family. Daniel sat at the head, silent, eating with mechanical precision. Lily picked at her food, glancing occasionally toward Grace as if checking she was still there. Grace made light conversation, careful not to overstep, though she noticed Daniel watching her more than his plate. "She showed me her drawing today," Grace said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "The one with 2 sons." Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. His eyes flicked toward his daughter, then back to Grace, something unreadable passing over his face. "She's never shown that to me," he said quietly. "Maybe she will, if you ask her about it sometime," Grace suggested carefully. Daniel did not respond, but he did not dismiss the idea either. He simply returned to his meal, though Grace noticed his eyes drifting toward Lily more than once for the rest of dinner. Later that night, long after Lily had been put to bed, Grace was walking back toward the staff quarters when she heard a soft cry echoing down the hallway. She followed the sound and found Lily's door open, the girl sitting upright in bed, tears streaming down her face, her small body trembling. "Lily," Grace said softly, rushing to her side. "I'm here. What happened?" "Bad dream," Lily whispered between sobs. "The garden was on fire. Mommy was there, and then she wasn't." Grace sat on the edge of the bed and gently pulled the girl into her arms, letting her cry against her shoulder. She did not offer empty promises. She simply held her, rocking slowly, humming a quiet tune under her breath, until the sobs began to slow. Neither of them noticed the figure standing silently in the doorway. Daniel had come to check on his daughter after hearing faint sounds through the walls, something he rarely did, since he usually left such matters to staff. He stood frozen, watching Grace comfort Lily with such natural tenderness that it startled him. He had tried, in his own clumsy way, to comfort his daughter through the years, but he had never learned how. Watching Grace do it so effortlessly stirred something uncomfortable in his chest, a mixture of gratitude and shame. He stepped back into the shadows before either of them noticed him and returned to his study, where he sat for a long time without writing anything at all. The next morning, Victor Marino arrived at the estate earlier than expected, his expression tense as he found his brother in the study. "You hired her already?" Victor asked, dropping into the chair across from Daniel's desk. "The new nanny. I heard she talked back to you yesterday." "She has opinions," Daniel said flatly. "It's not a crime." "It's a risk," Victor said. "We don't know anything about her. She could be connected to the Cross family for all we know." "She's not connected to anyone," Daniel said. "I had her checked before she stepped foot in this house. Ordinary background, no ties to any of our world." Victor studied his brother for a long moment. "You're different this morning." "I'm the same as always." "No," Victor said slowly. "You're not." Daniel did not respond, returning his attention to the papers on his desk, though his mind kept drifting back to the image of Grace, holding his daughter through her tears, humming softly in the dark. Over the following days, Grace settled into a careful rhythm within the house. She learned Lily's small routines, the games she liked, the quiet moments she needed before bedtime, the way she flinched at loud noises, but relaxed the moment someone hummed softly nearby. Slowly, the girl began to open up more, offering small pieces of herself that had been locked away for years. Grace also began to notice things about the household itself, things she chose not to question, exactly as instructed. Men who came and went at strange hours, hushed conversations behind closed doors, a tension that lived beneath the surface of every room like a held breath. She understood, without needing to be told, that this family lived in a world far more dangerous than the polished marble floors suggested. But she also noticed something else. Small changes in Daniel Marino, subtle enough that most people would miss them. The way his shoulders loosened slightly when he heard his daughter laughing from another room. The way his eyes lingered a moment longer on Grace during dinner, before he caught himself and looked away. One evening, nearly a week into her employment, Grace found herself in the garden with Lily as the sun began to set, the sky turning shades of orange and pink above the manicured hedges. Lily was chasing a small orange butterfly, laughing freely for the first time since Grace had arrived, a bright, unguarded sound that seemed to echo through the quiet estate. Grace did not notice Daniel watching from the study window until she glanced up and caught his eyes through the glass. For a moment, their gazes held, neither looking away. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one, a muscle memory long forgotten trying to remember how to move. He turned away before it could form fully, retreating into the shadows of his study, but Grace had seen it. And somehow, she knew that small twitch of his mouth had cost him more effort than commanding an entire room of armed men. That night, as Grace tucked Lily into bed, the girl looked up at her with sleepy, thoughtful eyes. "Daddy watched us in the garden today," Lily said softly. "I saw him through the window." "I saw him too," Grace admitted. "He doesn't usually watch," Lily said. "He usually just works." Grace smoothed the blanket over the girl's shoulders, considering her words carefully. Maybe he's starting to remember how to rest a little. Lily's eyes fluttered closed, a small, contented smile settling on her face as sleep finally claimed her. Grace sat beside the bed a while longer, watching the peaceful rise and fall of the child's breathing, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle into her chest. Down the hall, in the darkness of his study, Daniel Marino sat alone with a glass of untouched whiskey in front of him, staring at nothing, his mind replaying the sound of his daughter's laughter echoing through the garden for the first time in years. It was a small thing, an ordinary thing, to most people. But to him, it felt like the first crack of light breaking through a wall he had built brick by brick for over a decade. He did not know what to do with the feeling. So he sat with it, uncomfortable and unfamiliar, long into the night, while somewhere down the hall, the new nanny slept soundly, unaware of the quiet storm she had already begun to stir inside the coldest man in the city. Before sleep finally claimed him, Daniel found himself walking to the old bookshelf in the corner of his study, where a small framed photograph sat gathering dust, turned face down years ago because he could not bear to look at it. He hesitated for a long moment, his hand hovering over the frame, before finally turning it upright. His late wife smiled back at him from the photograph, radiant and full of life, exactly as he remembered her from the years before grief had hollowed out the house around them. "I don't know what's happening," he murmured quietly to the photograph, feeling foolish even as he said it. "I built this life to survive without feeling anything again, and now, there's a woman in this house who makes me forget why I built those walls in the first place." The photograph offered no answers, of course, only the same warm, unchanging smile it always had. But somehow, standing there in the dim light of his study, Daniel felt less alone than he had in years. He left the photograph standing upright when he finally retired to bed, a small, quiet act of permission he was not yet ready to examine too closely. The following morning brought a different kind of tension to the estate. Grace woke early, as she always did, and made her way toward the kitchen for tea before Lily's day began. The hallway near the study was unusually crowded, several men in dark coats speaking in low, clipped voices near the front entrance. Marta caught her arm gently before she could pass through. "Best to take the back stairs this morning," Marta whispered. "Mr. Marino has business visitors. It's not a good time to be seen wandering." Grace nodded and turned back without argument, though her curiosity lingered. She had noticed the pattern already, the way certain mornings brought unfamiliar cars to the gate, the way Marta and the other staff seemed to know instinctively when to disappear into quieter corners of the house. Grace had promised herself she would not ask questions, and she intended to keep that promise, no matter how much her instincts urged her otherwise. By mid-morning, the visitors were gone, and the house returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Grace found Lily in the small library room, sitting cross-legged on the rug with a picture book open in her lap, though her eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the pages. "Everything all right?" Grace asked, settling down beside her. "I heard shouting earlier," Lily said quietly, "from Daddy's study." Grace kept her voice calm and even. Grown-up business can get loud sometimes. It doesn't mean anything is wrong. Lily considered this for a moment, then nodded slowly. accepting the explanation with the quiet trust of a child who wanted to believe things were simple. Grace felt a small pang of guilt for the half-truth, but she reminded herself that her job was to protect the girl's peace, not to unravel mysteries that were not hers to solve. Later that afternoon, Daniel emerged from his study, looking more tired than usual, faint shadows beneath his eyes. He found Grace in the hallway, carrying a tray of tea toward the sitting room. "Marta said you took the back stairs this morning," he said, stopping in front of her. "She thought it best," Grace replied simply. Daniel studied her for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. "Whatever you heard, whatever you saw, it doesn't concern you. I need to know you understand that." Grace held his gaze without flinching, though her grip on the tea tray tightened slightly. She thought of the frightened look on Lily's face earlier that morning, the way the girl had flinched at every raised voice drifting through the walls, and she chose her next words carefully. "I understand the rule," she said, "but I want you to understand something too. Lily hears more than you think she does. She may not understand the details, but she feels the fear in this house whenever those mornings happen. If you want her to grow up steady, the house around her needs moments of steadiness too, even on the loud mornings." Daniel's expression flickered with something between irritation and reluctant consideration. He was not used to being challenged twice in the same week by the same quiet, unassuming woman, and yet he found himself listening rather than dismissing her outright. "What would you have me do?" he asked, an edge of genuine curiosity beneath the guarded tone. "Cancel the business that keeps this house running because my daughter might hear raised voices?" "No," Grace said simply. "Just remember to check on her afterward. A few minutes. Let her see that whatever happened in that study, it didn't take you away from her too." He said nothing for a long moment, but something in his stance shifted, the rigid line of his shoulders softening by a fraction. Later that evening, without announcing it to anyone, Daniel appeared in Lily's doorway just before bedtime, awkward and unpracticed, and sat with her for 10 quiet minutes while she showed him a new drawing. Grace watched from the hallway, careful not to intrude, a small, private smile tugging at her lips as she turned away to give them their moment alone. "I already told you I don't ask questions," Grace said steadily. "I meant it." Something in his shoulders eased slightly at her words. Though his expression remained guarded, he lingered a moment longer than necessary, studying her face, as though searching for some hidden motive he had not yet uncovered. Finding none, he seemed almost disappointed in himself for looking. "Most people who work in this house eventually want something from me," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Favors, protection, money. It usually surfaces within the first month." "I don't want anything from you," Grace said simply, "except maybe your trust, so I can do my job properly." "That's a strange thing to want," Daniel said, something almost wondering in his tone. "Not really," Grace replied. "It's hard to help a child heal in a house where the adults don't trust each other. Trust is the whole foundation of what I'm trying to build with Lily. It would help if it extended to you as well." Daniel considered this for a long moment, his gaze steady on her face. "Good," he said quietly, and continued down the hallway toward his study, leaving Grace standing alone with the tea tray and the growing certainty that whatever world she had stepped into, there was no turning back now. A plate shattered against the kitchen floor, and the entire house went still. Grace rushed toward the sound, her heart pounding, only to find Lily standing frozen beside the counter, a broken dish scattered around her feet, her small hands trembling. It was nothing serious, an accident, a cup slipping from small fingers, but the girl's reaction was far beyond what the moment called for. She stood rigid, eyes wide with a fear that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than spilled tea. "Lily, it's okay," Grace said softly, kneeling down carefully, avoiding the broken pieces. "It's just a cup. Nobody is upset." But Lily was not looking at Grace. She was staring past her, toward the doorway, where Daniel had appeared, drawn by the sound of the crash. The girl's breathing quickened, and for a moment, Grace understood with painful clarity that the fear was not about the broken dish at all. It was about disappointing her father. "Lily," Daniel said, his voice quieter than Grace had ever heard it, "look at me." The girl hesitated, then slowly lifted her eyes to his. "It's a cup," he said. "Cups break. That's all they're for. Eventually. He crouched down to her level, something he clearly did not do often, his tall frame folding awkwardly. "I'm not angry." Lily studied him carefully, searching for the truth in his words, and whatever she found there seemed to ease something in her chest. She nodded slowly, the tension in her shoulders beginning to loosen. Grace watched the exchange with quiet astonishment. It was a small moment, ordinary in most households, but inside these walls, it felt significant, like watching a door creak open after being sealed shut for years. Later that same afternoon, Grace took Lily into town for the first time since her arrival. A carefully arranged outing to a small bakery 2 streets from the estate, accompanied at a discreet distance by one of the household guards. Lily pressed her face against the bakery window, eyes wide at the trays of colorful pastries, and for a moment, she looked like any ordinary child on any ordinary afternoon, free of the heaviness that usually clung to her at home. "Can I get the one with the yellow frosting?" Lily asked, practically bouncing on her toes. "You can get whatever you'd like," Grace said, smiling as she guided her inside. They sat at a small table near the window, Lily happily working through her pastry, while Grace sipped a cup of tea, watching the girl with quiet contentment. It was in moments like these, ordinary and unremarkable to anyone passing by, that Grace felt the true weight of her purpose in that house. Lily deserved days like this, filled with yellow frosting and sunlight through a bakery window, free from guards and gates, and the heavy silence that lived behind them. "Can we come back here again?" Lily asked, licking a bit of frosting from her thumb. "I don't see why not," Grace said, "as long as your father agrees." "He'll agree if you ask him," Lily said matter-of-factly, with the simple confidence of a child who had already begun to notice things adults thought were hidden. "He listens to you." Grace felt her cheeks warm slightly at the observation, though she said nothing, simply smiling, and reaching over to wipe a small smear of frosting from the corner of Lily's mouth. When they returned to the estate that evening, Grace found herself recounting the outing to Daniel over dinner in more detail than was strictly necessary, and she did not miss the way his expression softened as he listened, nor the quiet promise in his voice when he said they would certainly be going back. Marta arrived to sweep up the shattered pieces, muttering softly under her breath about how she had seen more warmth pass between father and daughter in the last few minutes than in the previous several years combined. Grace said nothing, simply watching as Daniel lingered a moment longer beside his daughter, awkwardly patting her shoulder before rising to his full height again, as though uncertain what to do now that the crisis had passed. Once Lily had been settled and the broken pieces cleared away, Grace found herself alone in the hallway with Daniel, the tension of the moment still lingering between them. "She's afraid of disappointing you," Grace said carefully, aware she was stepping close to the boundary he had set for her. "I've never punished her for breaking something," Daniel said, his tone slightly defensive. "It's not about punishment," Grace replied. "Children absorb the mood of a house, even when nobody says a word. If this house has been heavy with grief and silence, she's learned to be careful with everything, including her own feelings." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he did not walk away, which Grace took as a small victory. "You think I've made her afraid of me?" "I think you've made her afraid of causing you more pain than you're already carrying," Grace said gently. "There's a difference, but it feels the same to a child." He was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face as if trying to determine whether she was offering criticism or simply the truth. "You speak plainly," he said finally. "Most people around me choose their words carefully, afraid of how I might react." "I'm not most people," Grace said. Something almost like amusement flickered across his face, gone as quickly as it appeared. "No," he agreed quietly. "You're not." He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway, as though weighing whether to say more. "There's a dinner tomorrow evening," he said finally. "Business associates. Nothing that concerns you directly, but Lily sometimes gets anxious when the house fills with strangers. Would you keep her upstairs, away from the noise?" "Of course," Grace said. "Would it help if I planned something special for her that night? Something to look forward to, so the evening feels like her own, instead of something she has to hide from?" Daniel considered this, something almost surprised passing over his face at the suggestion. "You think of things I never would," he admitted. "You think of security," Grace said gently. "I think of feelings. Between the two of us, she gets both." The following evening, as unfamiliar cars filled the driveway and the sound of clinking glasses and low conversation drifted up from the dining room below, Grace kept her promise. She and Lily built a small blanket fort in the corner of the nursery, complete with a flashlight and a stack of picture books, turning what might have been a frightening night into something like an adventure. Lily giggled under the blankets, her earlier anxiety forgotten, utterly unaware of the tension unfolding downstairs among men who spoke in careful, measured tones about territory and respect. Near midnight, once the guests had gone, Daniel climbed the stairs, exhausted from hours of careful diplomacy, and found the nursery door cracked open. Inside, the flashlight had died, and both Grace and Lily had fallen asleep together beneath the blanket fort, Lily's small head resting against Grace's shoulder. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply watching, something in his chest aching with a tenderness he had almost forgotten he was capable of feeling. He did not wake them. He simply draped an extra blanket over them both and turned off the hallway light before retreating quietly to his own room, carrying the image with him long into his restless sleep. The days that followed carried a subtle shift in the household's rhythm. Grace continued her careful work with Lily, building small routines that gave the girl a sense of safety: morning walks in the garden, quiet reading time before bed, simple games that encouraged her to speak her thoughts aloud without fear of judgment. Slowly, the girl's laughter became more frequent, her silences less heavy. Daniel, too, began appearing more often in spaces he had once avoided. He started joining them for short stretches in the garden, standing at a distance at first, then gradually closer, until one afternoon he sat down on the bench beside Grace while Lily played nearby, chasing a small dog that belonged to one of the household guards. "I used to sit here with my wife," he said quietly, without being asked. "Before Lily was born, we'd talk about nothing important. It felt like enough back then." Grace remained still, sensing the fragility of the moment, careful not to disturb it with the wrong words. "What was she like?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on his daughter running through the grass. "Warm," he said finally. "Everything I'm not anymore." "Grief doesn't erase who you were," Grace said carefully. "It just buries it for a while." He glanced at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You speak like someone who understands grief." Grace hesitated, unsure how much of herself she wanted to reveal. "I lost my mother when I was young. I understand what it does to a house, and to the people left inside it." Daniel studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, a recognition passing between them that needed no further words. Before either of them could say more, Lily came running back toward them, breathless and laughing, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary business of the afternoon. That evening, Victor arrived unannounced, finding Daniel in the study reviewing paperwork with unusual distraction. "You've been different lately," Victor said, dropping into the chair across from the desk, his expression tight with concern. "Ever since she arrived." "Her name is Grace," Daniel said without looking up. "I know her name," Victor said. "I'm asking why you're letting a stranger get this close. To Lily, to you." Daniel finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "She's good for Lily, that's all that matters." "Is it?" Victor pressed. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like more than that." "You're imagining things," Daniel said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. Victor leaned forward, his tone lowering. "Daniel, our world doesn't allow for softness. You know this better than anyone. If people start to think you've gone soft, they'll test you. They'll test the whole family. I'm not saying this to hurt you. I'm saying it because I need you sharp." Daniel's expression hardened slightly, the old walls rising back into place. "I haven't forgotten what we are, Victor. Caring about my daughter's well-being doesn't change that." "And the nanny?" Victor asked pointedly. "Does caring about her well-being fall under the same category?" Daniel did not answer immediately, and his silence said more than any words could have. Victor sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Just be careful," he said finally. "For her sake, and for yours." Victor rose to leave, pausing at the door with one last thought. "You know I only push because I care about this family, don't you? About Lily, about you. I lost enough when your wife died. I don't want to lose either of you to carelessness now." "I know," Daniel said quietly. "I've never doubted that." Victor nodded once, satisfied, and left the study, his footsteps fading down the hallway. After Victor left, Daniel sat alone in the study for a long time, his brother's words circling in his mind. He knew the dangers of his world better than anyone, the way weakness could be exploited, the way enemies watched for cracks in a man's armor. He had spent 12 years building walls specifically to avoid this exact situation, to protect himself from ever feeling something that could be used against him. Yet when he thought of Grace's steady voice, her patience with his daughter, the quiet strength she carried without ever raising her voice, he found it difficult to summon the same fear Victor wanted him to feel. Later that night, unable to sleep, Daniel found himself walking the halls of the house he had once shared with his wife. He paused outside Lily's door, listening to the soft, even sound of her breathing, a sound that had once been fragile and anxious, now steady and calm. He knew, without needing to be told, who was responsible for that change. He continued down the hallway and found Grace in the small sitting room near the kitchen, curled in an armchair with a book she had clearly stopped reading some time ago, her eyes distant and thoughtful. "You're awake late," he said from the doorway. Grace looked up, startled but not alarmed. "I could say the same about you." He stepped into the room, hesitating near the doorway as if unsure whether he belonged there. "I wanted to thank you," he said finally. "For what you've done with Lily. I haven't seen her this settled in years." "She's a wonderful child," Grace said simply. "She just needed someone to be patient with her." "You've been patient with both of us," Daniel said quietly, and something in his tone made Grace's chest tighten. "That's my job," she said, though the words felt smaller than the moment deserved. Daniel studied her for a long moment, the distance between them feeling smaller than it had any right to. "I don't think it's just your job anymore," he said quietly. Grace held his gaze, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. Neither of them moved to close the distance between them, both aware of the boundaries that existed for good reason, but for the first time since she had arrived, Grace allowed herself to wonder what might happen if those boundaries began to fade. "Good night, Grace," Daniel said finally, breaking the moment before it could grow into something neither of them was ready for. "Good night," she replied softly, watching him disappear down the hallway, her thoughts lingering long after the sound of his footsteps had faded into silence. Grace lay awake for a long while that night, staring at the ceiling of her small room, replaying the quiet moment they had shared. She thought of the agency file that had first brought her to this house, the clinical, distant description of a grieving widower and his withdrawn daughter, and how little those cold words had prepared her for the reality of either of them. She thought of Lily's laughter echoing through the garden, of Daniel's rare, hesitant smiles, of the careful way he had begun opening doors that had been sealed shut for over a decade. She reminded herself, sternly, that she was here for Lily first and foremost, that whatever strange warmth had begun growing between herself and Daniel needed to remain secondary to the child's well-being. But even as she tried to convince herself of that boundary, she could not deny the quiet flutter in her chest whenever she thought of the way he had looked at her in the sitting room that evening, as though she were something rare and unexpected that had wandered into his carefully guarded world. Sleep came slowly, carrying with it dreams of gardens in full bloom and a house filled with laughter instead of silence. Lily's scream tore through the house at 2 a.m, sharp and desperate, and Grace was out of bed before she was even fully awake. She reached the girl's room to find her curled on the bathroom floor, pale and shaking, a mess of sickness around her, her small body trembling with fever. Grace scooped her up without hesitation, murmuring soft reassurances, her mind already racing through what needed to be done. "Get Marta," Grace called down the hallway to the guard stationed near the stairs. "Tell her to bring towels and cool water, now." Within minutes, the household had come alive with quiet urgency. Daniel appeared in the doorway of his daughter's room, his usual composure cracked wide open at the sight of Lily's small body curled weakly in Grace's arms. "What's happening?" he demanded, though his voice carried more fear than authority. "She has a fever, and she's been sick," Grace said calmly, keeping her focus on Lily even as she addressed him. "It could be a stomach virus. I need to get her temperature down and keep fluids in her. Has she eaten anything unusual today?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted, and the helplessness in his voice was so unfamiliar, It startled Grace almost as much as the emergency itself. "I wasn't here for most of the afternoon." "It's all right," Grace said gently. "We'll figure it out. Right now I need cool cloths and small sips of water. Can you help me?" For a moment, Daniel simply stood there, a man accustomed to commanding rooms full of armed men, now standing frozen in the face of his sick daughter. Then something in him seemed to snap into focus, and he moved, fetching towels, filling a basin with cool water, following Grace's steady instructions without question. They worked together through the night, Grace managing Lily's fever with practiced calm, while Daniel hovered close, doing whatever small tasks she asked of him, his usual guarded distance replaced entirely by raw, unguarded worry. Around 4 in the morning, Lily's fever finally began to break, her small body relaxing into exhausted sleep, her breathing evening out. Grace sat back against the wall beside the bed, utterly drained, and only then did she notice Daniel sitting on the floor across from her, his tailored shirt wrinkled and damp, his hair disheveled, looking more human than she had ever seen him. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion. "I didn't know what to do. I've faced down men with guns without flinching, and tonight, I felt more helpless than I ever have in my life." "That's what love does," Grace said softly. "It doesn't care how strong you are anywhere else. It makes you feel everything." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching his daughter sleep peacefully for the first time that night. "I used to be good at this," he admitted, "before my wife died. I used to know how to comfort a crying child, how to stay calm in an emergency. Somewhere along the way, I forgot." "Grief does that," Grace said. "It doesn't just take the person you lost. Sometimes it takes pieces of who you were with them too." Daniel looked at her then, something raw and open in his expression that she had never seen before. "Tell me about your mother," he said quietly. "You mentioned losing her once, but you never said more." Grace hesitated, the request catching her off guard in the vulnerable hush of the early morning. But something about the moment, the exhaustion, the shared relief of Lily's fever breaking, made the walls she usually kept so carefully in place feel unnecessary. "She got sick when I was 12, Grace said quietly. "It happened slowly, over almost 2 years. I watched my father fall apart trying to hold everything together, working 2 jobs, trying to be strong for me while breaking apart inside. By the time she passed, I had already learned how to take care of everyone around me, because nobody else had the energy left to do it." "That's a heavy thing for a child to carry," Daniel said softly. "It taught me patience," Grace said. "It taught me how to sit with people in their pain, without trying to rush them out of it. I think that's part of why I do this work. I understand what it feels like when a house goes quiet with grief, and how much a person needs someone who won't leave when things get hard." Daniel absorbed her words carefully, something shifting behind his eyes. "I've had people leave when things got hard," he said quietly. "More than I can count. People who called themselves loyal until loyalty became inconvenient." "I'm not going anywhere," Grace said simply, and the words hung in the air between them, heavier than she intended, carrying a weight that went beyond her professional duties. Daniel held her gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them in the tired hush of early morning. "I believe you," he said finally, his voice quiet but certain. For a while, neither of them spoke, the quiet hum of the house settling around them like a blanket. Then Daniel shifted, resting his head back against the wall, his eyes still fixed on his sleeping daughter. "After my wife died, I made a decision," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a confession long held back. "I decided that feeling too much was a liability. In my world, the men who love too openly are the ones who get hurt, or worse, the ones whose families get hurt because of it. So I stopped. I built a version of myself that couldn't be reached, because I thought it would keep everyone safer." "Did it work?" Grace asked softly. "For a while," Daniel admitted, "but Lily grew up in the silence I built to protect her, and instead of protecting her, I think it only taught her to be afraid of feeling too much herself. I didn't see that until you arrived, and showed me what the alternative looked like." Grace felt something tighten in her chest at his honesty, a vulnerability she had not expected from a man who carried himself with such iron control in every other part of his life. Walls built out of love can still hurt the people they're meant to protect, she said gently. It doesn't mean the love wasn't real. It just means the walls need to come down eventually. I don't know how, Daniel admitted. I've forgotten what it feels like to let anyone close enough to matter. You're doing it right now, Grace said softly. Talking to me like this. That's how it starts. Daniel turned his head to look at her, something fragile and searching in his expression, as though he were seeing her clearly for the first time. I don't know what I would have done tonight without you, he said quietly. I would have been standing in that doorway, completely lost, watching my daughter suffer, and not knowing the first thing to do about it. You would have figured it out, Grace said. Parents always do, eventually. Maybe, Daniel said, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out alone. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching Lily sleep, until exhaustion finally caught up with them both. Daniel insisted Grace rest in the guest room nearby, rather than returning to the staff quarters at such a late hour, and for once, Grace did not argue. The following days carried the quiet residue of that night, an unspoken shift in the way Daniel and Grace interacted. He sought her out more often, not just for updates on Lily, but for simple conversation, asking about her thoughts on small matters, lingering in doorways longer than necessary. Grace found herself looking forward to these moments more than she was willing to admit, even to herself. Victor noticed the change immediately. He found Daniel in the garden one afternoon, watching Grace and Lily plant flowers along the garden's edge, his expression softer than Victor had seen in over a decade. You're not even trying to hide it anymore, Victor said, sitting down heavily on the bench beside his brother. Hide what? Daniel asked, though his voice lacked conviction. That you care about her, Victor said bluntly. I've known you our whole lives, Daniel. I've never seen you look at anyone the way you look at her. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching Grace laugh at something Lily said, her whole face lighting up with genuine warmth. I don't know what to do with it, he admitted finally. I built this life specifically, so I wouldn't have to feel anything that could be used against me. And now you're feeling everything, Victor finished for him. Yes, Daniel said simply. Victor sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired face. I won't pretend I'm not worried. Our world doesn't forgive weakness, and love looks like weakness to the people who want to see us fall. But I've also never seen Lily this happy, and I've never seen you look this alive, even if you're scared of it. I am scared, Daniel admitted quietly, more scared than I've been in years. Then be careful, Victor said, because if the wrong people notice what's happening in this house, they won't hesitate to use it against you, Grace included. The warning settled heavily over Daniel for the rest of the day, a shadow creeping over the fragile warmth that had begun to grow within the estate's walls. He watched Grace more carefully after that, not with suspicion, but with a growing awareness of just how much he now had to lose, and how dangerous his world could be for someone who had never asked to be part of it. That evening, after Lily had been tucked into bed, Daniel found Grace in the garden, standing beneath the fading light of sunset, her expression thoughtful and distant. You're quiet tonight, he observed, stepping up beside her. I was just thinking about how much has changed in such a short time, Grace said softly. This house feels different than it did when I first arrived. You changed it, Daniel said simply. Grace turned to face him, something vulnerable flickering across her expression. I care about Lily, about both of you, more than I probably should, given everything. Given everything, Daniel echoed quietly, understanding exactly what she meant. I care about you too, Grace, more than I know what to do with. The confession hung between them in the quiet evening air, fragile and unguarded, two people who had spent years building walls, now standing at the edge of something neither of them fully understood. Neither moved to close the distance, both aware of the dangers such a step could invite, but for the first time, neither of them looked away either. It's getting late, Daniel finally said, though he made no move to leave. Lily will be up early tomorrow, full of questions about the garden we promised her. She will, Grace agreed, a soft smile touching her lips. She's already planned exactly where the sunflowers should go, according to her drawing. Sunflowers, Daniel repeated, something warm entering his voice. My wife used to grow those, along the east wall, before everything changed. I haven't thought about that in years. Maybe it's time this garden remembered what it used to be, Grace said gently. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, something settling behind his eyes, quiet and certain. Maybe it is, he agreed. He reached out, briefly, to touch her hand, a small, uncertain gesture from a man unused to reaching for anything he was afraid to lose. Grace let her fingers curl around his, just for a moment, before they both stepped back into the ordinary boundaries of the evening, aware of how much had shifted between them, without either of them saying so directly. The following morning brought a lightness to the house that Grace had not felt since her arrival. She woke to the sound of Lily's laughter, drifting up from the garden, unusual for such an early hour, and dressed quickly to join her. She found Daniel outside as well, still in his shirt sleeves, kneeling in the grass as Lily tried, with great seriousness, to teach him how to properly build a daisy chain. "You're doing it wrong," Lily informed him, her small hands working deftly, while his large fingers fumbled with the delicate stems. "You have to be gentle, or they break." "I'm being gentle," Daniel protested, though a stem snapped between his fingers as he spoke, drawing a fresh round of giggles from his daughter. Grace stood at the edge of the garden for a moment, simply watching, her chest tight with an emotion she did not yet have a name for. It was such an ordinary scene, a father and daughter playing in the morning sun, and yet within these walls, it felt like witnessing something rare and precious, a fragile new growth pushing up through ground that had been frozen for over a decade. "Grace, come help him," Lily called out, waving her over. "He's hopeless." "I am not hopeless," Daniel said, feigning offense, though his eyes were warm with amusement when they met Grace's. "I simply have delicate hands, unsuited for floral crafts." "Sure," Grace said, laughing as she knelt down beside them both, taking a stem from Lily's outstretched hand. "Watch carefully, even hopeless men can learn." They spent the better part of an hour in the garden, three unlikely companions bound together by circumstance, and increasingly, by something that felt far deeper than obligation. By the time the daisy chain was finally complete, draped haphazardly around Lily's neck like a queen's crown, Daniel had laughed more freely than Grace had ever heard, a rich, genuine sound that seemed to surprise even himself each time it emerged. It was the kind of morning Grace would remember long after, a quiet, golden hour before the world outside these garden walls remembered they existed. The morning after the daisy chain in the garden, Grace found a small folded note tucked beneath her door when she woke, written in Daniel's precise, careful handwriting. It contained only a few lines, thanking her for the previous evening and for what she had brought back into his home, signed simply with his name. No flourish, no excess sentiment, just an honest acknowledgement that had clearly cost him effort to put into words. Grace kept the note tucked inside the pages of her favorite book, returning to it more than once over the following days, whenever her own doubts crept in about how quickly her feelings for this fractured little family had grown. 2 days later, a package arrived from a delivery service Grace did not recognize, containing dozens of individual seed packets of every kind of flower a garden might hold, along with a short note in the same careful handwriting, explaining that Lily deserved more than daisies to weave into her chains, and that perhaps Grace would help her plant an entire garden of her own choosing. It was such a small gesture, but Grace found herself sitting on the edge of her bed for a long while afterward, the note in her hands, feeling the quiet, careful way this guarded man had begun to show his affection, not through grand declarations, but through small, deliberate acts of thoughtfulness that revealed far more than words ever could. That peace did not last. A black car Grace did not recognize sat parked outside the estate gates when she returned from the market, and every instinct in her body told her something was wrong before she even stepped through the front door. Inside, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Guards stood at tense attention along the hallway, their expressions carefully blank in the way Grace had come to recognize meant serious trouble. Marta intercepted her near the stairs, her face pale. "Take Lily to the east wing, and stay there," Marta whispered urgently. "There's someone here to see Mr. Marino. It's not a friendly visit." Grace did not need to be told twice. She found Lily in the library and guided her upstairs with calm, practiced ease, careful not to let her own rising fear show on her face. But even from the east wing, she could hear raised voices drifting faintly from the study below, tense and sharp. though the words themselves remained indistinct. An hour later, once the black car had finally driven away, Daniel appeared in the doorway of the East Wing sitting room, his expression carved from stone, a coldness in his eyes that Grace had not seen since her very first day in this house. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Alone." Grace settled Lily with a picture book and followed him down the hallway to his study, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and dread. Once the door closed behind them, Daniel turned to face her, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. "Her name is Elena Cross," he said without preamble. "She represents a rival family. She came here today to deliver a message." "What kind of message?" Grace asked carefully. "That word has spread about changes in this house," Daniel said, his voice tight with restrained anger. "About me softening. About a nanny who has become far more than a nanny in the eyes of anyone watching closely. She mentioned you by name, Grace. She knows exactly how long you've been here, and exactly how important you've become." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. "What does that mean for me?" "It means you're a target now," Daniel said, his voice breaking slightly at the admission. "Anyone connected to me closely enough to matter becomes leverage in this world. I should have seen this coming. I should have kept my distance from the beginning, for your sake." "Daniel," Grace said carefully, stepping closer despite the tension radiating from him. What exactly did she threaten? He was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes dark with something that looked dangerously close to fear, an emotion Grace had never associated with him before. "She implied that if I don't reassert control, remind people of who I am, they'll test that weakness through the people I care about, through Lily, through you." The weight of his words settled heavily in the room. Grace's mind raced through the implications, the danger she had unknowingly stepped into simply by caring for a child and, eventually, for the child's father. "I want you to leave," Daniel said suddenly, the words seeming to cost him enormous effort. "Tonight. I'll arrange transportation somewhere far from the city, and I'll make sure you're financially secure for years. This is not a request, Grace. It's the only way I know how to keep you safe." Grace stared at him, something fierce rising in her chest, despite the fear still coursing through her veins. "And Lily? What happens to her if I disappear tonight without explanation? Do you have any idea what that would do to her, after everything we've built together?" "I'll explain it to her eventually," Daniel said, though his voice wavered with uncertainty. "It doesn't matter. Your safety matters more." "You don't get to decide that for me," Grace said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "I came into this house with my eyes open, Daniel. I understood what world I was stepping into, even if I didn't know all the details. I'm not running now because things have become complicated." "This isn't about complications," Daniel said, his voice rising with frustration born from fear rather than anger. "This is about your life. People in my world don't make idle threats, Grace. Elena Cross does not waste words." "Then let me help you figure out how to protect all of us," Grace said firmly. "Instead of sending me away like I'm something fragile that needs to be hidden." Daniel stared at her, something conflicted warring behind his eyes, the instinct to protect clashing violently with the growing understanding that Grace was not the kind of person who could simply be sent away and forgotten. "You don't understand what you're asking," he said quietly. "I understand exactly what I'm asking," Grace replied. "I'm asking to stand beside you instead of being pushed aside. I've spent my whole life taking care of people who needed me, Daniel. I'm not going to stop now, especially not when it matters most." The room fell into heavy silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on both of them. Finally, Daniel exhaled slowly, some of the rigid tension leaving his shoulders, though the worry in his eyes remained. "If you stay," he said carefully, "you follow every instruction I give you without question. Security will increase around the entire estate. You won't leave the grounds without an escort. If anything feels wrong, anything at all, you come to me immediately." "I can do that," Grace said, relief flooding through her chest. Daniel moved to the window, peering through the heavy curtain toward the darkened grounds, his posture tense with restless energy. "There's something else you should know," he said, his back still turned to her. "Elena Cross didn't come here on her own authority. She was sent to test the waters, to see how far the rumors had spread and whether they were true. That means her family already believes I've grown careless. Careless men lose everything in my world, Grace. Territory, respect, sometimes worse. What happens now? Grace asked. Now I remind them why nobody has challenged this family in over a decade, Daniel said, turning back to face her, something hard and determined settling into his features. I need to be seen. Strong, controlled, exactly the man they remember. It's the only way to make them reconsider testing us again. And if that's not enough? Grace asked quietly. Daniel was silent for a long moment. Then we prepare for the possibility that this doesn't stay quiet, he said finally. I won't lie to you about the danger, Grace. I respect you too much for that. But I promise you, this house has weathered threats before, and it will weather this one too. Grace nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his words, aware that the comfortable rhythm they had built over the past weeks was about to be tested in ways she had not fully anticipated. Yet even with fear coiling tightly in her chest, she found herself more determined than afraid, unwilling to let the shadow of a rival family unravel everything that had been so carefully rebuilt within these walls. I mean it, Grace, Daniel said, stepping closer, his voice low and urgent. I've already lost one person I love to this world. I won't survive losing another. The word love hung in the air between them, spoken almost accidentally in the heat of his fear, but neither of them moved to take it back. Grace felt her heart swell, despite the danger surrounding them, a fragile hope blooming in the middle of the fear. You won't lose me, she said softly. Over the following days, the estate transformed into something closer to a fortress. Additional guards patrolled the grounds at all hours, security cameras were checked and upgraded, and Victor practically moved into the house, coordinating protective measures with grim efficiency. Grace adjusted her routines with Lily carefully, keeping their activities confined to the house and garden, explaining the increased security in gentle terms that would not frighten the girl unnecessarily. Lily, perceptive as always, sensed the shift in atmosphere, but trusted the calm reassurance in Grace's voice, more than the tension radiating from the adults around her. Is something bad going to happen? Lily asked one evening, her small hand gripping Grace's sleeve as they walked through the garden under the watchful eyes of two guards. Your daddy is just making sure everyone stays extra safe, Grace said gently. Nothing bad is going to happen to you, I promise. Lily was quiet for a while, watching the guards pace slowly along the far hedge. My mommy went away and never came back, she said suddenly, her small voice barely above a whisper. Is that going to happen to you too? The question struck Grace like a physical blow, and she knelt down immediately, taking both of Lily's small hands in hers. Your mommy's leaving wasn't anyone's fault, and it wasn't because your family did anything wrong, she said carefully, choosing each word with great care. I know it must feel scary to see all these guards and extra locks, but I am not going anywhere, Lily. Not because I promised, but because I want to be here, with you and your daddy, for as long as you'll have me. Lily studied her face for a long moment, searching for any trace of uncertainty, and finding none, she finally nodded, some of the tension leaving her small shoulders. Okay, she said simply, the trust in her voice both a gift and a responsibility Grace felt settle heavily and gladly across her chest. They continued their walk in comfortable silence after that, Lily occasionally pointing out a particularly interesting beetle, or an unusually shaped cloud, her fear folded away for the moment, replaced by the simple curiosity that belonged to childhood. What about you? Lily asked, her eyes wide with sudden worry. Are you going to stay safe too? Grace knelt down to the girl's level, cupping her small face gently. I'm not going anywhere, Lily. I promise you that. The words felt heavier than they should have, given the danger circling closer to the estate with each passing day, but Grace meant them with every fiber of her being. She had come into this house to care for a lonely child, and somewhere along the way, without fully realizing it, she had fallen in love with the entire fractured family, father included. That night, after Lily had finally settled into sleep, Grace found Daniel standing alone on the back terrace, staring out into the darkness of the garden, his posture tense with the weight of responsibility he carried for everyone within these walls. You should be resting, Grace said softly, stepping up beside him. I can't, Daniel admitted. Every time I close my eyes, I see all the ways this could go wrong. We'll get through it, Grace said, reaching for his hand in the darkness, her fingers wrapping around his in quiet solidarity. Daniel looked down at their joined hands, something breaking open in his chest that he had kept sealed shut for 12 long years. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly. "I don't deserve you standing beside me after everything I've dragged you into." "You didn't drag me anywhere," Grace said firmly. "I chose to stay. I choose to keep choosing it. Every single day, for as long as you'll let me." Daniel turned to face her fully then, the distance between them finally closing as he reached up to gently cup her face, his thumb brushing softly against her cheek. "I haven't felt like this in 12 years, he admitted, his voice raw with vulnerability. "I didn't think I was capable of it anymore." "You are," Grace whispered. "You just needed someone patient enough to wait for it to come back." The kiss that followed was slow and careful, two broken people finding something unexpected and precious in each other amid the danger surrounding them, a fragile promise of warmth in the middle of an uncertain storm. When they finally parted, Daniel rested his forehead gently against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily in the quiet darkness of the garden. "Whatever happens next," he said softly, "I need you to know that these past weeks have given me back pieces of myself I thought were gone forever." "Whatever happens next," Grace echoed. "We face it together." They stayed there a while longer beneath the darkening sky, the fear that had gripped the house for days, momentarily forgotten in the quiet comfort of each other's presence. Inside, Lily slept soundly, unaware of the promise being made just beyond her window, a promise that would soon be tested in ways none of them could yet imagine. Marta watched from the kitchen window, a soft, knowing smile on her weathered face, before quietly drawing the curtain and leaving the two of them to their moment beneath the stars. 2 days passed in a tense but manageable rhythm. Additional patrols circled the estate through the night, and Victor coordinated closely with contacts across the city, gathering information about Elena Cross's movements and intentions. Daniel grew quieter during this time, his focus sharpening into the controlled intensity Grace imagined had once made him a formidable presence in his world, though he never let that hardness touch the way he spoke to her or to Lily. On the third evening, as the household settled into its usual quiet, Grace noticed Daniel standing at the study window long after dinner had ended, watching the darkened tree line beyond the garden wall with an intensity that made her uneasy. "You're worried," she said softly, joining him at the window. "I'm always worried," Daniel admitted, "but tonight feels different. Call it instinct." "Should I keep Lily closer than usual?" Grace asked. "Yes," Daniel said quietly. "Just for tonight, keep her near you. I have a feeling we haven't seen the last of this yet." Grace nodded and made her way upstairs, where she found Lily already drifting toward sleep, her small stuffed rabbit tucked securely beneath one arm. Grace settled into the armchair near the bed, rather than retiring to her own room, telling herself it was simply caution, though a deeper unease had settled into her chest as well, something she could not quite name, but chose not to ignore. She thought of everything that had brought her to this room, this house, this fragile new life she had not expected to fall into so completely. She thought of Daniel's hand around hers in the garden, of Lily's trusting eyes searching her face for reassurance, of the quiet, steady love that had grown between all three of them despite every reason it should not have. Whatever the night ahead might bring, Grace found herself unwilling to imagine a version of her life that did not include this fractured, healing little family. Outside, the guards continued their quiet patrols along the darkened perimeter, and somewhere beyond the estate walls, in a part of the city Grace had never seen, plans were being finalized that would test everything they had built in the weeks since her arrival. Neither of them could have known just how soon that promise would be tested. The alarm system tore through the silence of the estate at 3 a.m, red lights flashing along every hallway, and Grace was on her feet before she had even fully processed the sound. She rushed to Lily's room first, gathering the frightened, sleepy girl into her arms, murmuring calm reassurances, even as her own heart hammered against her ribs. Down the hallway, she could hear shouted commands, the heavy footsteps of guards moving with practiced urgency, the unmistakable tension of a household bracing for real danger. Daniel appeared in the doorway moments later, fully dressed despite the hour, his expression carved into hard, focused lines that Grace had never seen on him before. This was not the tired, grieving man who sat quietly in his study, or the tender father who had knelt awkwardly beside his daughter's broken teacup. This was the man his reputation had been built on, sharp and dangerous, and utterly in control. "Someone tried to breach the east perimeter," he said quickly, his eyes scanning the room to confirm both Grace and Lily were unharmed. "Security caught it before they got close to the house, but I need you both in the safe room immediately." "Is it them?" Grace asked, though she already knew the answer. "It's them," Daniel confirmed grimly. Elena Cross decided words weren't enough. He led them quickly through a hidden passage behind the library bookshelf, down a narrow staircase to a reinforced room beneath the house, stocked with supplies and monitored by its own security feed. Grace settled Lily onto a small cot, holding the trembling girl close, humming the same quiet tune she had used that first frightened night weeks ago. "You'll be safe here," Daniel said, kneeling briefly to press a firm kiss to his daughter's forehead. "I need to handle this." "Daniel," Grace said urgently, catching his sleeve as he turned to leave. "Please be careful." He paused, turning back to press a quick, steady kiss against her lips, his eyes holding hers with fierce determination. "I intend to come back to both of you," he said firmly. "Nothing in this world matters more than that." Then he was gone, the reinforced door sealing shut behind him, leaving Grace alone with Lily in the tense, humming silence of the safe room, the muffled sounds of activity filtering faintly through the walls above. The following hour stretched into what felt like an eternity. Grace kept Lily distracted with quiet stories, her own mind racing with worry she refused to let show on her face. She thought of everything that had brought her to this moment, the frightened, silent child she had first met weeks ago, now curled trustingly against her side, and the guarded, grieving man who had slowly let down his walls one careful moment at a time. She thought of Daniel's words in the garden, the vulnerability in his voice, as he admitted how much he had already lost, and how terrified he was of losing more. She refused to let herself imagine a version of tonight that ended in loss. Finally, after what felt like hours, the reinforced door opened, and Victor's voice called down calmly, signaling the danger had passed. Grace gathered Lily into her arms and climbed the narrow stairs, her heart pounding with anxious hope. She found Daniel in the main hallway, overseeing the final security sweep, a faint scrape along his jaw, the only visible sign of the confrontation that had taken place. The moment his eyes found Grace and Lily, something in his entire body seemed to loosen, relief washing over his sharp features. "It's over," he said, crossing the distance quickly to pull them both into his arms. "The threat has been neutralized. Elena Cross underestimated how prepared we were." "Is everyone safe?" Grace asked, still holding Lily close. "Everyone within these walls is safe," Daniel confirmed. "That's all that matters." Lily stirred against Grace's shoulder, lifting her sleepy head to look at her father. "Are the bad people gone?" she asked, her small voice still thick with drowsiness. Daniel crouched down to meet her eyes directly, his tone gentle, despite the exhaustion etched into his face. "They're gone," he said, "and they won't be coming back. I promise you that." "You always keep your promises," Lily said, with the simple, unquestioning faith only a child could offer. "I intend to keep this one especially," Daniel said, glancing briefly at Grace with quiet meaning, before pressing a kiss to his daughter's forehead. Marta arrived with warm blankets and tea, fussing gently over all three of them despite the late hour, relief evident in every line of her weathered face. "This house hasn't seen a night like this in years," she murmured, tucking a blanket around Lily's shoulders. "But I have a feeling it's the last night like it we'll see for a long while." Grace hoped, with her whole heart, that the old woman was right. As the household slowly settled back into an uneasy calm, guards resuming quiet posts around the perimeter, Grace carried Lily back up to her room, humming softly, until the girl drifted back into peaceful sleep, untroubled by the danger that had passed so close to their door that night. Victor approached, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and something close to respect, as he looked at his brother, holding his family close, without any hesitation or self-consciousness. "You handled that well tonight," Victor said quietly. "Sharp, controlled, exactly like you needed to be. But I also saw something else out there tonight." "What's that?" Daniel asked. "A man fighting for something worth protecting," Victor said, a small, genuine smile tugging at his mouth. "Not just business, family. I think I finally understand what's been different about you these past weeks. Daniel looked down at Grace and Lily, both still held securely in his arms, and something shifted openly across his face, no longer guarded or hidden away. I understand it too, he said quietly. It took me 12 years to understand it, but I finally do. In the days that followed, the estate slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, though the security measures remained firmly in place as a precaution. Word had spread quickly through the rival networks that the Marino family was neither weak nor vulnerable, and the threats that had loomed so heavily faded into cautious silence. Victor stayed on at the estate for several days after the incident, overseeing the final repairs to the perimeter security and meeting quietly with contacts across the city to confirm that the message had been received. He found Grace alone in the kitchen one morning, preparing tea before the household woke, and lingered in the doorway rather than passing through as he usually did. I owe you an apology, he said finally, startling Grace, who had not expected such words from him. For what? She asked, setting down the kettle. I doubted you, Victor admitted. I thought you were a risk to this family, someone who didn't understand what she was walking into. I was wrong. I watched you hold that little girl together, through a night that would have broken most people, and I watched my brother become someone I haven't recognized in over a decade, in the best possible way. That's not nothing. Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, unexpected coming from a man who had never hidden his suspicion of her. Thank you, Victor. That means more than you probably realize. Just take care of them, Victor said, his voice gruff but sincere. Both of them. They've earned a little peace. I intend to, Grace said simply, and something like understanding passed between them. A quiet truce, forged in the aftermath of danger, survived together. Before Victor left the estate that afternoon, he paused at the front door, glancing back toward the garden where Daniel and Lily were once again attempting, with mixed success, to build a proper daisy chain. Take care of him too, Victor added quietly, almost as an afterthought. He spent 12 years being strong for everyone else. It's about time someone was strong for him. Grace watched Victor's car disappear down the long driveway, his words settling warmly into her chest. She understood exactly what he meant, and she understood, too, that she had already been doing exactly that, quietly and without fanfare, for weeks now. Grace resumed her routines with Lily, though now Daniel joined them more often than not, no longer content to watch from a distance through the study window. He learned the small rituals that had once felt foreign to him, morning walks through the garden, quiet afternoons of reading together, the simple, ordinary warmth of a family healing itself one day at a time. One golden evening, weeks after the danger had passed, Grace stood on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft shades of amber and rose, Lily chasing fireflies across the lawn with bright, unrestrained laughter that no longer carried any trace of fear. Daniel stepped up quietly beside her, wrapping an arm gently around her waist, watching his daughter play with an expression of open, unguarded contentment. I never thought I'd see her this happy again, he said softly. She was always capable of this happiness, Grace said. She just needed to feel safe enough to let it out. You gave her that, Daniel said, turning to look at Grace with quiet intensity. You gave both of us that. Grace smiled softly, leaning into his embrace. We gave it to each other. Lily glanced back toward the porch, catching sight of her father's arm around Grace's waist, his head tilted close to hers in quiet conversation. And then, for the first time in the girl's memory, she watched her father's face break into a genuine, unguarded smile, warm and full, reaching all the way to his eyes. Lily froze for a moment, stunned by the sight, before a matching smile spread across her own small face. She abandoned the fireflies and ran toward the porch, throwing her arms around both of them at once, small and fierce, and full of the joy that had been missing from this house for far too long. You're smiling, Daddy, she said, breathless with wonder. You never smile. Daniel knelt down, pulling his daughter into a tight embrace, his eyes glistening with an emotion he no longer felt the need to hide. I have a very good reason to now, he said softly, glancing up at Grace, with unmistakable love shining in his gray eyes. Later that night, once Lily had finally been coaxed to bed, still glowing with the excitement of the evening, Daniel and Grace sat together on the porch steps, the garden quiet around them, the last fireflies blinking lazily in the darkness. Daniel reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in plain cloth, turning it over in his hands for a moment before offering it to her. "It isn't much," he said, sounding almost nervous, an emotion Grace had rarely seen cross his face. "But I wanted you to have something that was hers, once. Something that meant this house was a home." Grace unwrapped the cloth carefully to find a small silver locket, delicately etched with a pattern of vines and flowers, worn soft with age. Her breath caught in her throat. "Daniel, I couldn't possibly," she began, but he shook his head gently, closing her fingers around the locket with both of his hands. "She would have wanted it worn by someone who loved this family the way you do," he said quietly. "I've kept it locked away for 12 years, unable to look at it without falling apart. Tonight, for the first time, I looked at it and felt only gratitude, because it led me here, to this porch, with you." Grace felt tears gather in her eyes, and she did not try to stop them. "Thank you," she whispered, clasping the locket gently in her palm. "I'll wear it with the same love it was given." Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close against him, as the night settled deeper around the estate, the danger of recent weeks feeling impossibly distant beneath the calm, star-scattered sky. For the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future felt like something worth looking forward to, rather than something to be endured. The garden around them settled into peaceful night quiet, fireflies drifting lazily through the darkness, the estate that had once felt like a fortress of silence now humming softly with the quiet, steady sound of healing. 12 years of silence had finally broken, not through force or fear, but through the patient, steady presence of a woman who had walked into a house of grief and chosen, day after day, to stay. And as the last light of evening faded into stars scattered across the night sky, Daniel Marino held his daughter and the woman he loved close, finally, after all those long years, feeling whole again.